Legacy of a King, a Legacy Series novel by Charlene Sponsel. Chapter 1, Iliota of Weselder, 76th day of spring, 446. Excitement hummed in my veins as I overlooked Alonji Castle's ballroom. It would be the largest entitlement ceremony of the season. Thinking back, it was the beginning of my end, but I could only envision the world of possibilities at my feet. Moonlight gleamed off jewels in the crowd of young people below, old sovereignty heirs who hoped the king and queen would choose them as mates for their children. My stomach nodded as I adjusted the simple leather braid resting on my forehead, and I attempted to glean support from my brother beside me. He flopped his hair over his eyes and fixed them down the corridor. His eyes were like my mother's, which had shined like smoky gray moonbeams through a frosted window. I blinked my drab puddles, an endless source of teasing in the Westfall. Why does he hide them? If I had her eyes, I would show them proudly. I fingered the blue-silver encrusted banister as I waited for the herald to call my name. I hated my name. Iliota sounded dull and antiquated, like a person from history who would do nothing more than mate and have babies. As if my life had been exciting. It was my first trip outside Weselder, and I was 11 cycles old, but I had dreams of being more. Iliota, daughter of Nile, tradesman of Weselder, the herald announced. The room hushed. Entitled, disinterested faces watched my descent, making my heart pound so loudly I was certain they could hear. Halfway down the never-ending steps, candles sweetened the air with honey, and the queen's famous crystal chandelier cast rainbows on the dizzying miles below, to the dismissive looks of the sovereign class. I imagined my mother among them to steady me, and was mere steps from my goal when a massive crash came from the great hall. I glanced inside, distracted by servants arguing as they picked up shards of crystal, and I stumbled. Pain stabbed through my hands and knees as I fell on the merciless marble floor, while a boy in the crowd failed to stifle his laughter, if he tried at all. My face heated, and blood throbbed in my ears, muffling the herald's voice as he called my brother's name. Elixum, tradesman of Weselder. Elix had the same disapproval I often saw in his eyes. Rushing to an empty corner, I let my body slide to the floor, burying my head between my knees as if it would make me invisible. I don't belong here. I want to go home. Do not worry yourself, child, a stranger said, his voice deep and gentle. My father will be angry, I whispered into my gold knee pants so he wouldn't see me cry. He crouched in front of me. You are young and have many entitlement ceremonies ahead of you. I apologize for my son's laughter. Do not let it trouble you. I intended to contradict him, but as I lifted my head, my eyes fixed on his gleaming blue-silver crown, and I froze. He caught hold of my hand and straightened. I followed as if in a trance. Sire, I curtsied in an obvious afterthought, tucking a wayward strand of hair behind my ear. They will forget in time. Come, I will make your introductions. It's unnecessary, King Tali, but I thank you for your kindness. My hand shook as he led me forward, regardless of my refusal. Iliota of Weselder, this is my mate, Queen Verin. Her dainty crown of blue silver and amethyst sat on dull black hair. Her skin was pale and sallow, with none of the violet hues of her people. She lifted her gaunt hand. I hesitated before I took it and curtsied. It was only a moment, but she cast her eyes downward and gestured to the seat beside her. Please, sit with me. The slow cadence of her voice revealed the effort it cost her to speak. While the queen greeted other guests, I fingered the silk needlework at the edge of my tunic. King Tali's forest green eyes sparkled at his queen, enamored as a child is with the first snow. I stared past them, blinking back moisture. An ever-forester leaned against the grand staircase. Between his brown skin and clothes as black as the dark forest, he was a shadow, and a shudder coursed through me. I tore my eyes away as the queen said, You should meet my son, Kamek. Had I been paying attention, I may have avoided what followed. Would you fetch him for us, my love? The king's smile lit his handsome face as he left us. It caused an involuntary sigh to escape me, which thoughtlessly formed the words, "He loves you." I shut my eyes, waiting for reprisal. My father always scolded me for being impertinent. Instead, the queen's soft voice said, "Yes, he does." And her forlorn lavender eyes followed him. My vision blurred and I bowed my head to hide my tears. The marble tiles on the ballroom floor were slender right triangles, like their initials, a T overlaid with a V. Was it intentional? You had the entire ballroom's attention as you entered. Your skin is flawless. I concentrated on my fingers, embarrassed by her assessment of me. The handmaids used powder. They said my skin was too white. Nonsense. You have shading developing along your cheekbones, burgundy, like your hair. My cheeks warmed my hands as I covered them. It is your eyes I noticed first. Brown is an unusual color for a West Forester. Yes, your majesty. King Tali returned and encouraged his son to step forward. Iliota of Weselder, may I present our youngest, Kamek. I curtsied, as was my obligation, but refused to meet his gaze. Please forgive my outburst, he said, a smirk on his face. Your misstep was unexpected. His eyes flashed with amusement. His skin was a deep radiant brown like his father's. He wasn't much older than I, but forest green highlights that appear in maturity already modeled his mop of brown hair. Someone shouted his name, and he glanced at his father for permission to leave. A moment later, he snickered at me with a group of friends, making me wish I'd never met him. We must find you a dance partner, King Tilly grinned, revealing deep-set dimples. He bowed to us both and kissed the queen's hand before leaving. I glared in Kamek's direction and pursed my lips. He looks like the king. He takes after his father in many ways. My eyes rolled, and I hoped the queen didn't see. King Tali was tender-hearted and gallant. His son was neither of those things. I plastered a smile on my face as the king returned with a Vinland boy who asked me to dance. I accepted, but glanced back at the queen, reluctant to leave her. Will you sit with us for the feast? She asked, proving how transparent I was, and that her purported generosity had not been exaggerated. My spirits soared. No one received that kind of invitation. Though the moons had reached their apex, I was ready to dance all night under the ceiling of painted clouds with my handsome Vinland partner. But as we danced, my mind wandered back to the queen. Everyone said pleasant things about sovereignty. Seldom had the entitled lived up to such adulations. But the queen spoke graciously to any guest who approached her, even the dark man from beside the stairs. With an immutable expression, he kissed her hand and sat beside her as if he belonged there. Yet she regarded him with tenderness. The queen was lovely once, my partner said. My parents knew her during the war. I nodded, holding back from scoffing at the boast. The king had introduced us, and I assumed he hadn't pulled a stranger from the crowd. You don't know who I am, do you? He was one of the entitled, but nothing struck me as unusual. Should I? I am master of the Cantonac Vinlands. Right, I giggled, his ridiculous claim going too far. Don't believe me? Do you expect me to after stepping on my toes? You aren't even old enough. My entitlement ceremony is in the fall. I'll make sure you're invited. If you say so, a bell chimed. What's that? Dinner. He escorted me to a polished watercolored paintwood table upon a stage set with cut glass goblets and polished blue-silver cutlery. The metal was more expensive than gold. I had never seen it used for something so ordinary. My brother sat at one of the common tables with a wooden cup, glowering at me. But Princess Belia interrupted my view of him. When someone thought of a princess, she came to mind. She had dark Everforester skin. Violet shading contoured her face and highlighted her black curly hair. Konica held her in high regard for her devotion, and she was the measure of every girl as they reached maturity. We all fell short. A cordial smile adorned her face as she made her way to the table, but her eyes narrowed, and her smile disappeared as she stood across from me. "These tables are for sovereignty," she said to the servant behind my chair. "Not climbers after my mother's crown." "She is my guest," Queen Varin said, interceding on the boy's behalf. "Seriously, Mother?" The queen smiled and blinked at the princess in the exact way my father did in public when he meant for me to shut my mouth. I pursed my lips to prevent my grin from spreading, and the princess's glower fell on me. But I didn't care. Me, under the queen's protection? I was invincible. None at our table sat before the queen did. The gesture was significant, as were the sovereign couple's linked fingers. I ate a few bites of the foreign dishes, terrified everyone was waiting for the commoner at the sovereign's table to make a mistake. As they ate, I listened to conversations entitled throughout Konica. My people, West Foresters, revered beauty and grace above everything. I was taught the Westfall was the center of art and literature, and Westcastle was its crown. But the education I received at the sovereign table was more honest than anything I learned in school. It was the best night of my life, and over too soon. To Queen Varin's surprise, and mine, I wrapped my arms around her tiny waist. Would she be here for the next season's ceremony? "Thank you. I will remember you always." "Be well," I mumbled as a tear spilled onto my cheek. The king supported her so she could remain standing to bid her guests farewell. "Be happy," Queen Varin responded, holding both my hands in hers. I kissed them, curtsied, and backed away. "What was that?" Elix asked as I sagged onto the carriage seat. "You wouldn't understand. You squandered an entire evening without a single prospect to show for it. What a waste," he said, treating me like I ruined his life, as he always did. I ignored him and peered out the window facing the gray castle, a mere shadow against the darkened sky. "You made a phenomenal fool of yourself, tripping down the stairs and pestering the queen. Wait until father learns what you've done, useless child," he scolded me. Alonji Castle faded away through the early morning fog like a dream, making my chest ache. "Cry all you want. It may work on father, but it will not work on me." He balled his cloak and thumped his head on it. "You know nothing," I said through clenched teeth, and regardless of his closed eyes, I glared at him. I wrapped my cloak around my legs, providing them more warmth than my flimsy stockings, and imagined I was dancing, while the gentle rocking of the carriage lulled me to sleep. The 4-day trip from Alonji to my home in Marketon crawled by with only Elix's disappointment for company. I waved out the carriage windows as we rolled through the hills, past row after endless row of vines, pretending I was a queen. The field workers among them obliged my fantasy by waving in return. Carriage wheels assailed my ears as we rumbled over the bridge into Weselder, and quieted as we made our way down Market Street. The setting sun fell on the empty street, giving it an eerie quality. Buttoned-down curtains of the merchant stalls flapped in the wind, but the spicy, sweet pollen of caracat trees scented the air, not manure like Alonji. My excitement grew as we approached the cottage, reminiscent of the row houses in the poorest sections of Alonji. Crooked red clay shingles, not thatch, covered the roof, but the plaster had cracks I had never noticed. I had an overwhelming desire to sweep our stoop of debris and plant flowers to set it apart. Seeing my father, I jumped from the carriage in an unladylike fashion before it came to a full stop and ran into his arms. "Lily, how was it?" "Marvelous, but she tripped," Elix said. I kicked a stone, disturbing the russet dust which landed on my shoes. "It won't happen again." "It can't. A mistake is understandable. You were nervous." He squeezed me to his side. "But we need a good match." "Father, she spent the evening wallowing. It's unforgivable," Elix scowled at me. "Lily, these events are a great expense. I didn't wallow. I kept the queen company, which she asked me to do, Elix." "Because she felt sorry for you," he taunted. "Enough. Elix, take the trunks inside so the carriage can go." My father paid the driver. His tattered clothes were a significant contrast to the excess I recently enjoyed. His shading had diminished until it was only visible under his cheekbones, making him appear cycles older than he was. "I'm sorry." I hid my face in his cloak. His clothing hung off his frame, reminding me of the Queen's much too tiny waist. Kamek laughed at me. If not for King Tali, I wouldn't have had a single offer to dance. "Iliota, you won't find a match in the sovereignty, and your stunt will reduce our invitations further. The cycles before you reach entitlement are precious. Our invitations are few enough, and they will become fewer still. I've nothing to offer you, child." Sorrow clouded his gray eyes as he said, "I wish I had." I was too young to remember our lives before the Elderman's War. For 6 cycles, I had held on to memories, repeating them often. My mother told me of the farmhouse, the land that followed the river, and the fields of fluffy feder flowers. I imagined the gentle bray of Bailon and the stink of the stockpots as they cooked silk cocoons. She told me it smelled like men's feet, and her nose wrinkled as she said so. She said my father traveled and traded with the greatest families in Konica, his clothes clean and the newest fashions. The tiny cottage I called home was the only one I knew, and it had limited space for a small garden and some poultry. "I can attend the local events, and those in Onioma," I said to bring him hope. I had a faint memory of him smiling at her while he stood by the crumbling fireplace in the cottage. It wasn't the loss of his land or livelihood that crushed his soul, but losing my mother. "Father, what's wrong with Queen Varin?" "No one knows." "Will she get better?" "We hope so." His heart-rending, faraway stare suggested he, too, was thinking of my mother.